You're listening to Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Eric Vansel.
And I'm Daryl Sanders.
And as usual, we're your hosts for the show. And, yesterday, of course, was Star Wars Day, May the 4th. And today, Revenge of the 5th. And in celebration of Revenge of the... And then, of course, there's a lot of, people that share the Mandalorian meme where they say this is the May. So it kind of goes, the whole month. But either way, we're in the middle of celebrating a Star Wars weekend. There's a re-release on the Phantom Menace that came out yesterday. There was like this whole Star Wars marathon, which I was tempted to go to. But at 20 hours... I'm like, you know what? I could see these movies at home on nearly, proportionally speaking, it's almost as big of a screen, and I could do it from the comfort of my own home. But either way, we're celebrating Star Wars. Monday, the show, we do plan to go over the Phantom Menace 25th anniversary, by the way, and talk about, what is it like now after 25 years? Now, of course, we did review it last year, and we basically, as part of our What is Star Wars series, and we gave our current thoughts, but it's not so much really talking about a current review of the film, although some of that will undoubtedly be in there. It's really more like, how are people viewing the prequels today? And, was the Republic technically the good guys? That's another theme that we might explore on that too. But today we're talking about the Bad Batch season and series finale. And so I got to say, same thing, I thought it moved just as much. Now, Ted Adam Green, of course, is with us, and he's already chatting. So I figured, all right, let's for once, instead of giving our initial thoughts, let's let one of our viewers give their initial thoughts. So he's basically talking about, it was a great series finale. The only person who we found out that died on the team was just confirmation of the death at the end of the last season. The rest of the family made it unexpectedly. And yet, you know what? That's true, is that we really, there were a couple of deaths, and we'll get into that as we get into the review, but it is strange that this was almost kind of a happy ending. And he goes on to say, but that's what I like so much, a rare happy ending. And you shouldn't really put that in quotes. I mean, it kind of...
Yeah.
It has a little negative or positive.
Especially me being a massage therapist.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel kind of a way about that.
It's like, come on, man, where's the happy ending? Come on, let's go. What am I paying you for here?
If I had a dime for every time I've heard that, I'd probably be rich as George Lucas. But
yeah, well, I guess we could get a Star Wars happy ending in honor of Star Wars weekend. But yeah, that's true. It was a rare, let's just say, positive ending, so we can, for those of us who are 12, or at least had that mentality, we can get around that. But it was, and I thought that it moved as quick. I'll tell you this, though. There was a couple of things that were disappointing from a fan perspective, but I think from a story perspective, it made sense. And number one of the things that we had talked about the whole time was thinking that Asajj Ventress might return to team up with them and help them out. And it would have been cool to see, but again, I think from a story perspective, that would have been the cliche, typical thing to do. I like the fact they didn't do that. And then the second thing is that, Rampart dying and sort of turning back to, I guess, evil or whatever. It was kind of nice because the last couple of episodes we talked about how much we really liked the chemistry between him and the rest of the Clone Force 99 and, just the banter they had back and forth. And he actually made a refreshing addition to the team, right? And there was just a lot of things. And I remember mentioning that, hey, I could actually watch a series like, Rampart and the Clones or something. I don't know. Whatever. But of course, from a story perspective, we've seen that a lot. We saw that with Callus. We saw that with, a few other people where you even get a lot of these Imperials who you find out are moles, like Hux in the sequel
Mhm.
trilogy. And so it is nice that you get a guy who actually is like, no, I'm an Imperial guy. If I see an opportunity, I'm going to take it and all that. And then, of course, there was no more chance of him obviously returning. But I don't know. Overall, I would say it was a good end. Maybe I don't know but do you think it was a good end to the? Here's the thing, and this is a question I'll pose to you for when you're giving your overall thoughts.
Mhm.
One, do you think it was a good season finale, and do you think it was a good series finale? Because they could differ.
I think it was a good season finale, not necessarily a good series finale.
And I agree with that. By the way, David's joining
Um,
us.
hey, what's going on, David? Um, yeah, man. I think. Well, first of all, like I would enjoy the episode. I thought it was really good. I mean, it was cool that it was longer, so I
Mm-hmm.
enjoyed that. Um, and so it made the pacing, go well. Um, yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying about a size Ventress. I think that would have been cool. But I think that would have been the cliche thing to do, especially how would she just come out of? I mean, the only way I could see her showing up is if she found out about where Tantus was as well. Because remember, she kind of had a soft spot for the kids, and if somebody else hired her for the job to go find their kid or something, then that would make sense for her arrival being there. But other than that, like it wouldn't make sense for her to just pop up out of thin air, out of nowhere, unless they just had a way to contact her,
No, I mean,
somehow.
well, but that was one of the things that we both brought up at different times was that the episode that she did appear, in which she did
Mhm,
appear, we thought we didn't know it was going to be one and done. I mean, it turned out that that was probably the smartest thing to do from a storytelling perspective, but
mhm,
we thought maybe she would have, maybe pop up periodically over the next few episodes, or like you just said, maybe there was somebody else is hiring her, maybe Fennec Shand or somebody found out that maybe Omega was captured and she's almost going on her own mission.
mhm. Yeah, I think with Record being hurt, that added an element because I honestly thought he was actually going to be a goner.
Yeah,
Um,
I know. I thought the same
and
thing. I was
I was
like,
hoping not because actually I love
ugh.
Record.
I know. But being that it was
But
a series finale though, they could honestly, because if you think about it, anybody that they kill off at this point, I mean, what does that
you
mean?
know,
They just don't appear in a future comic or book or something, or you know what I mean? It's like
right.
you could do that almost with no consequences at this point. So I thought the same thing you did.
Yeah, especially with him being hurt the whole time and even watching Crosshair like saying, "Hey, the plan has to change because you can't do what you used to do. So we kind of have to pivot here
Hmm.
to make this work." Rampart, he's just like, "Look, just leave him. Just all right, let's just almost like cut our losses and let's just get on with it." And I really love the fact that Rampart See, I didn't think Rampart would actually stay good because of that one line that he made. I mean, it would have been cool if he would have stayed, more or less on the good side because he's hilarious. However, when he told Crosshair, "You're the same. You're just like me," and
Hmm.
it's not even so much that Rampart likes being in the Imperial. Rampart likes to be on the winning side, and
Yeah.
he looks at the situation from like perspective of okay, because his whole thing is like, you can't win this. It's way too many. Like, I know the Empire, I know what they have. I mean, and they're too well organized, and it's too few of you to make this work. I mean, yeah, sure, you guys have kind of skirted around, but this is Tantus. This is I don't even know anything. You know what I mean? And he's looking at it from that perspective of, look, I just want to be on the winning side and come out on top, and whatever I have to do that, I'm going to do. So that's why he teamed up to help him because he thought it was going to get him out of the Imperial thing. And then he gets roped back into it. He's like, mother, you know,
Yeah, no, that's a good
why do I?
point.
So
No, that's a
he's more of
very
an
good point.
opportunist.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Kind of like whoever, because if you when you look at it, it's not like he has some thing against them, really. There's no personal thing. There's no
Mm-mm.
ideological conflict there. It's just basically like, okay, you guys are getting me out, so you're my new best friends for a while. And then
Mm-hmm.
when you go and you do something stupid, well, then we have to part company. And then, of course, in this episode, when he has the opportunity to basically pick up a blaster and, hey, I could use, maybe I could bargain with this data, then
Mm-hmm.
it's like, yeah, I'm going to do that. And it's, like you said, opportunism the whole time. It's not necessarily any kind of a particular side or any kind of a loyalty or ideology that he's loyal to. It's really more about, hey, I just want to be on the side that's in power, pretty much.
That serves me. That serves
Mm
my best interest, and my best interest is being alive. So, however that looks, that's where I'm going to be.
hmm. Mm hmm.
um, I think Omega really stepped up a lot in this episode because she had to be to these kids what her brothers had to be to her in the
Yeah.
sense of instilling that confidence in a situation where they were trying to climb up that ladder and he's like, well, I kind of have a thing with heights. And she kind of had to give him the pep talk, like, listen, it'll be fine. And she had to remain calm and be able to, and she has this loyalty of I can't leave anybody behind. And we saw that with who was it, Echo, who got was it Echo who got caught up by when they went to the ship. I can't remember, but I think it was Echo who kind of like, and she's like, all right, well, we got to go back because we can't leave
Yeah,
them.
it was. But if you think about it, it was even before that, right? Because
Yeah, well, Crosshair the
Crosshair.
same way.
So,
Yeah,
I mean,
Crosshair's the same
that
way.
has been,
That's
like you said, a theme. Yeah.
hmm yeah, and so I really thought this was a really good episode. I thought it was a good season finale. The ending of it was I like how they fast forwarded to show Omega more grown up now.
Yeah, it,
Like
it
they
kind of had Rebels vibes, where they try to do a little bit of an epilogue. Now, I don't think they went as far as Rebels did, because Rebels went like after episode 6. This
yeah.
seems like it's around episode 4, maybe 5, but probably 4 because it's not like she's a woman yet.
hmm
She's probably like maybe late teens.
Yeah, she's like to be like 17 or something around there.
Yeah, 18, somewhere
But
in there.
but the fact that she's like, all right, I gotta go. I can't just stay here. You guys have fought your fight. You guys have done it all. I haven't. Like my journey is still has to be written,
Mm-hmm.
and they're like, no, we got to keep you safe. Which this the only thing that kind of mystified me is the fact that they went back to Pabu because it's not like the Empire doesn't know that's where they found him to be at the
Yeah,
first place.
I
I
know.
thought that was kind of stupid, and it was cool that they went back there. I mean, granted, they're like more underground, but still, like
Well, you know what I
you
think it
know,
is? I think the reason why they went back there is because even though technically they were on Hemlock's and those guys' radar, not necessarily the Empire. Because if you think about it, it's just like with the end with Tarkin's thing. He's like, okay, well, forget this. Now let's just put it all in the Stardust. Of course, we know it's the Death Star project. That's all he
mhm,
cares about. He doesn't care anything at all about this necromancer thing, Omega, none of that. Once Hemlock was killed, once he's dead, and all that other stuff, it's pretty much like anybody that really knew about Pabu is really gone. The Empire doesn't really know, nor do they seem to care really. It was because of Hemlock's obsession and because of Necromancer and all that I think that was the case.
well, yeah, I think so. It's kind of weird because on one hand, I would think that the Emperor would still care because the fact that he was so adamant about it, and the fact that he made a personal trip over there to ensure that everything was, on schedule and going well. The only thing is that to your point with Tarkin, yeah, that is a valid point. However, I would just say if if the Emperor cares that much, I think they probably should care.
They should care,
And I
but the
think
thing
it
is,
but I think it probably went it probably became a moot point once Hemlock and Lamase died because
and all the
those were the
data's gone.
architects. Yeah, and all the data's gone. So it's like, okay, we can't do anything. Anyway, if we did have her, it's kind of like we have to start from scratch, and we don't have that type of time or resources or money to when we have this other project that's almost as equally important.
Well,
We
I
can
also
funnel everything towards that.
exactly, and I also think that a lot of it also has to do with the fact that a lot of that was it was the whole Camino thing, right? Because that's
Hmm.
why now let's say it was kind of like this is Camino, and it's basically like it's really our thing, and you guys are just repurposing it basically for something else a
Hmm.
little bit more nefarious. But essentially, this is still a thing, and because it's still a thing, I think that part of it is that that's where the Emperor's going to pick it up with Grogu later. Once they start to get Pershing. Once Dr. Pershing comes in and he
Yeah.
restarts the whole thing, okay, now he's come up with his own stuff. So now they have enough data, information, whatever, in order to actually restart it. But at this point, they're pretty much crippled and there's almost no point. But even if they
Yeah.
were, and this is the point I was going to make, even if they were, let's say the Emperor was still like, yes, we got to do this. Nobody that knew about Pabu is still alive, pretty much at this point. It's almost like Pabu is the way that it was before they discovered it.
Hmm.
So it wasn't, they're still technically safe there, is basically, the point.
Yeah. Yeah. I do like, even in this shot that you have here, they show Hunter with this whole grizzly beard and
Yeah, it's
some new eye
gray,
makeup. So to show
he's
the age
older.
and
Yeah, that he's
yeah.
older. Yeah, I mean, the whole
And
ending of the thing was really good. And I like you said, I'm glad that they did a similar thing that they did with Rebels, where they did fast forward a little bit and give us an epilogue scene, because if you're going to do a series finale, and this is why I think that this one falls a little short as a series finale, because again, even though you can make the argument that, look, this is about the Bad Batch, this isn't about the greater, war or whatever. It's about them, and it's through their eyes that we're seeing all these events unfold. I
mhm.
still think that in a way, I would have liked to have seen more context for the epilogue scene, because it just, I don't know. It was the whole thing was a little lackluster to me. I mean, it pains me to say it because this thing has just been knocking it out of the park since episode 1. And if this had just been the conclusion of this season, like you said,
Mhm.
it would have been perfectly fine. I would have been praising it, you know,
To high
up.
heavens.
Yeah, exactly. But the problem is that it's not. It's the end of the series. And I think that maybe even though they needed to tie it up, it almost seems like, and again, I'm not necessarily suggesting they do another full episode just to tie it up either. They could have very
Mhm.
easily have just done the epilogue a little differently or extended it. But I mean, I guess, if you're really looking at it for what it is, it's like, okay, the clones are just going to live happily ever after, and Omega's going to go off and fight for the rebellion. So, I mean, really, you could also make the argument, what more do you really need to know or say?
Well, let me ask you this question. Do you feel like the season finale answered all of our questions?
Uh, I don't know. I mean, the thing is, we're still a little. I think that if you look at it, I'll put it like this. If you look at it from just this series, no. If you look at it from the greater franchise story, then probably yes, because obviously we're not really supposed to know too much about Necromancer. This is just the beginnings of it. It really doesn't pick up steam until the Grogu storyline. I think that that's really where it picks up. Now, it would have been nice if they had referenced that maybe in The Mandalorian, and now in The Bad Batch, we get to see the origin story of Project Necromancer. Because if you think about it, we know as an audience member that these things are connected just because of context.
Hmm. Yeah.
But they don't really specify that, though. Not the way they did
Well,
with Project Stardust.
well, that's the thing. I think that's what that's going to be the premise of the Mandalorian Grogu movie. I think that's where we're going to get that.
Yeah, I
The
would hate
whole
to. I mean, what, you think it's going to be a prequel movie?
No, I mean I think it's going to be the whole Necromancer continuation.
Yeah, but
Like if
Pershing,
you,
didn't he
what I
die?
mean is purging. I don't think so. I thought he was so. When you talk about Project Necromancer, which we learned in Rebels, I think no, I mean not Rebels, Bad Batch. So we have that, and then remember, like, okay, so in the Mandalorian, of course, Din is trying to protect Grogu from Gideon because they're trying to do this whole replication thing. We don't know all the way, so I think that's going to be the we're going to see the furtherance of that in the Mandalorian Grogu movie
Maybe,
because
because that's essentially, that is Project Necromancer. I mean, obviously what they started, right? Because they had the Zillo Beast in there because they wanted to make some sort of impervious armor for their
Mhm.
troopers. And they have Omega because they're trying to make these like force sensitive troopers or clones or whatever. And that's essentially what they were trying to do in, the whole Grogu thing, which of course is what we find ultimately becomes a key component of Palpatine's resurrection and then also as Sith troopers. But again, none of this is really clarified. I won't even say it isn't
Yeah,
spelled out. It just isn't clarified. It would be nice to get clarification on it.
that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm thinking. That's going to happen in the Grogu movie. I think that's where we're going to get like the full scope of everything, or at least majority of what we've already seen. Like, okay, this is Project Necromancer. I mean, and there still may be, some a a nugget that's left out there because they want us to show, okay, the whole thing with Palpatine and Snoke. Like, we probably won't get that in Mando and Grogu. But that's because maybe once again, we've always talked about there's 30 years in between the Mandalorian and the sequel trilogy. So once again, you still can drop different episodes. I mean, not episode, but series, movies, and things that put us closer to the sequel trilogy that could further explain how Palpatine eventually comes back. Because we still never got that answer in the sense of how did he even get resurrected to begin with? I mean, we saw Snoke, and he said, "Well, I created Snoke." Well, when? At what point did Palpatine actually
Well, that's
return?
it. But that's it. See, I think that's why I say we got no clarification, because if you look at the context of this whole thing, that's what it
Hmm.
is. The problem
Yeah.
is that it's up to the audience to actually come to that conclusion. It's very muddy.
Hmm.
It's obvious that Snoke was a failed Palpatine clone and he just was kind of, I guess, paving the way, right?
Hmm.
I mean, but the thing is, and that's part of the whole Necromancer thing, that's why, it started with the whole Omega thing and then it popped into, Grogu. He became sort of the new Omega when Omega was no longer available, which of course we don't know
Hmm.
why, and so on. And that's where it becomes a little bit sloppy storytelling. See, if they had just definitively said, okay, here are these points, now we're going to go back and fill in the gaps, I think it would be a lot stronger. But the problem is they're not. And of course, a lot of this is because remember, if Colin Trevorrow had done episode 9, none of this would have been happening.
True.
And I doubt very seriously Filoni would have even done this whole Necromancer storyline. But what happened
No.
was They're like, oh, well, we got Palpatine like coming back. Well, now we gotta maybe set that up and come up with a reason why.
Hmm.
So that's the reason why I think you're getting a little bit of this sloppy storytelling and a lack of clarification on these things. But I think that now that you have this thing in the can now, right? The Bad Batch is over. You have it's part of the story. Now moving forward, and maybe this is what you're talking about, where it's like, look, in the Grogu Mandalorian movie, now you could start filling in the details.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think you could fill in the details. I think if you want to explain Omega, if you want to what happened to her, you could bring her up, or you can actually she might still be around at that
Sure.
time. You could do that. I think, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that yeah, we wouldn't be talking about any of this if the Colin Trevorrow film would have been made. So, but I think because, and we've talked about this on previous shows like a while ago, not necessarily a soft reboot, but almost kind of like a, all right, we realize that fans are kind of upset about a lot of different things, especially when it pertains to the sequel trilogy. So, in order to smooth that over a bit, let's kind of explain the and fix the story, fix some plot holes. So then that way the sequel trilogy makes a little bit more sense to people. And it may not fix everything, but at least it's a little bit more palpable, or that people can like, all right, I can more or less get with it a little bit more now that I have all this backstory.
Yeah,
And I think
exactly.
that's what it seems like what's happening.
Well, I hope so. Even though, I mean, I hate to say it, but I think a lot of people are just like, you know, I'm done.
Screw it. Yeah, I'm
I
done.
mean,
Yeah.
because if you think about it, just because Trevorrow was either left the project or kicked off the project, however they want to spin it, doesn't even
Mhm.
matter what the truth is in this case. They could have just moved forward with that story, though. I mean, they had it. It was fleshed out. It was
Mhm.
complete. They had a script.
Mhm.
Now, there may have been a few like legal things, like, well, okay, we're going to have to pay him. But listen, whatever they had to pay Trevorrow to use that storyline probably would have been worth it to save the franchise. Instead of doing this irrevocable, oh man, I can't talk. I'm still feeling the effects of being sick, by the way. I don't know how long this thing is going to last, but I got sick last week, guys, which is why we didn't do Friday's show. And I had a little bit of a relapse, and it was crazy. And I'm still feeling that fogginess of it. But I mean, they did what many considered to be irreparable harm. And the problem is that they could have avoided that. That's where I think I have a little bit of the issue is they could have avoided it altogether. But all right, they didn't. No use crying about it, but at the same time, I don't know, I just partially feel like maybe the smart thing to do would be to, and they're sort of doing that, right? I think they're doing a combination of both. I think they're doing a soft reboot, but I think they're also adding context to a lot of things that happen in the sequel trilogy in order to soften the blow. That'd probably be the best way to put it.
Yeah, I think so. I think one of my unanswered questions um that I still have from the Bad Batch is what's up with Omega? Because she's in an altered clone. She has a high M count. We see that maybe she may not have the propensity to use the Force, or she doesn't have the maybe there just wasn't enough time to figure out if she has the skill set there. But we also kind of saw that she was a strategist in a way, and so we've seen her develop that in different ways. Because it's funny how even the Bad Batch was like, no, it's like, okay, well, was that Omega or was that Echo? And it was like definitely Omega. Like they definitely know her style. So it's like, all right. I just wonder, like, okay, what are her special abilities though, or does she have any?
I don't know. I think strategy might be the thing because even Leia basically. didn't use the Force in the traditional way, at least until much later.
Right.
But it would come out, though, in her being able to convince people. And she would use things for diplomacy. So she more or less had a diplomatic use for the Force. But she still undeniably had it. Whereas
And it was
Asajj,
actually documented too,
and it was
though. It's
documented.
actually, and we actually seen it, like in the sense of when Luke was talking to her, like, hear me, Leia, and she's like, Luke,
Right, yeah,
we got to
there's
go back. Like
exactly. There's a
we've
little bit of that
seen,
telepathic communication thing, exactly. Whereas when
yeah,
Asajj tried to train Omega, it was like, all right, just got nothing.
yes, yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
even if there was a small glimmer of it, and it was just a matter of, okay, you just need to be trained or there's time, but no, Asajj is just like, nope,
Because
nothing.
that's really weird to me, considering that, okay, she's wanted by essentially the Emperor because she has, not only does she have a high M count, but her blood allows whatever chemical bonding thing that they're trying to do, it works with her. So she's definitely different.
Oh,
And
she's
then so
different,
you would,
yeah, but
no, I mean, but what I'm saying is her having this high M count is okay. We've always known that that's a measuring, one of the bigger measuring sticks to see if you have the propensity to use the Force. Yet you got poor little Sabine over here who basically has no M count. Even Huang is just like, you're the worst possible. But yet, like, we see her, she's at least able to, pull a lightsaber to her. You see
well,
what I'm saying? So
I know, but
it's kind of weird.
I think that that's part of the problem with this current Star Wars thing. Is they keep changing the rules. I mean, you can look at the M count thing from the standpoint of, well, okay, the Force uses M count, but maybe there's other things that use it too. Maybe there's a propensity to be able to do other things if you have a high M count. It's not just a Force thing. But, then of course, yeah, you look at, see, this is the whole reason, and it goes back to what I was saying before. They really should have left this whole midi-chlorian thing out of it. This is a problem when you try to make this thing too science fiction-y. It's
Hmm.
it's by definition a fantasy film.
Yeah,
And the only sci-fi part of it that should really be in there is just the setting. The
or the
setting,
technology.
the
Yeah.
technology, that kind of thing. When you start trying to cram explanations into stuff, that's when you're going to start to lose the whole thing, because first of all, especially when you're trying to incorporate these things, it was sort of like you had Obi-Wan's explanation in episode 4, which I thought was the best thing to do. They should have just left it at that. Force binds us, it surrounds us. There's people that have a natural propensity to tap into that. They're identified as children. We take them as children, we train them. Okay, got it, fine. They could have left it at
Hmm.
that. All right, then Lucas comes along and he does his midi-chlorian thing. All right, I guess you could just maybe leave it at that. But once you get beyond that, and that's what they're doing, well, now
Hmm.
you've got all kinds of problems because of what you just brought up. Well, why does Sabine have a little bit of like propensity to use the Force, but Omega doesn't?
Hmm.
Yet she has a high M count that at least rivals probably what Grogu has.
Yeah, I mean, but I mean, and I guess the bottom line is, I mean, I think the answer to it is training, because at least Sabine, at least in Sabine's defense, and thinking about it, Sabine did have Ahsoka for a while to kind of pull that, and she still didn't really show that much promise. She showed it a little bit. So it's like, okay. Omega's never had anyone train her in the Force since the time she was born. And now, has she been around the Jedi or something around that time? Then yeah, probably so. But considering that she's been around, most of her development has come either from Lama Say or the Bad Batch. It's kind of hard to try to um make her tap into something that usually takes people years, and they tried it in one day, essentially. And it's like, well, let's
But
just
the
use this
only
one day.
argument for that would be maybe a strategic use, because even with Leia never
Right.
really used it in the, telekinesis and all that other stuff way that we're used to
Hmm.
seeing it. But, and her being, the daughter of the, or granddaughter of the Force aside, just if you look at what's been given to us in canon, it's like, okay, she's used it kind of the same way Luke did, where Luke used it subconsciously, piloting skills, hey, I got some accuracy
Hmm.
when I fire a weapon, that kind of thing. It's like,
Hmm.
okay, whatever. The point is, there was an aptitude that was clearly there. It just had to be focused.
Hmm.
And each time, Luke basically tested Leia. Now, they haven't canonized that specifically, although conceptually they have, that he basically took her on, started training her. She showed a little bit of aptitude. Okay, now the training part is what actually hones the skill. Same thing with Grogu. Ahsoka put him through that little test on that one planet
Hmm.
when she was telling, Din who he was and what his name was. And she's like,
Hmm.
okay, yeah, he actually has some stuff going on. Take him to Luke. Asajj tests Omega and is like, get nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Well, and once again, in the if we're keeping it within canon, okay, you're dealing with the grandchildren of the Force with Luke and Leia. So there's that. But then you look at someone like, once again, Omega, you know,
But
she
Grogu
could
wasn't the
have
grandson of the Force. The point is,
no.
everybody that they did. Now, I mean, the way that you could do it though, even with Anakin, again, son of the Force, but still, the idea is that with all these people, they they'll test the midi-chlorian thing, but they give them like a little. It's sort of like the Force version of an IQ test.
Hmm.
And if you can't even pass that, it doesn't really matter what your midi-chlorian count is. And they've established this with other characters, even in the new
Yeah.
canon books and comics. So it wasn't just an expanded universe thing. They've done that a little bit in the movies and TV shows. They really did it in some of the books. And so I think that what they're trying to establish, and again, we don't really know what stories they've greenlit already for the future,
Hmm.
but I think that they're trying to demonstrate this whole, hey, you can have a high midi-chlorian count, but that doesn't necessarily make you force sensitive thing. I think that that's where they're going with this.
That's possible. But I guess to your argument though is like, so, and all I'm doing is playing by the canon rules, right? Which we know sometimes can be a little shoddy. But okay, you have Anakin. Yes, he's the son of the Force, so of course, naturally, he's gonna. I mean, it only makes sense, right? And of course, his offspring. Once again, naturally, it makes sense that
Hmm.
their children are going to be, have those aptitudes. Now, Grogu, yes, granted, he's not the son or the child of the Force. However, his species, number one, is known for being pretty Force sensitive to begin with. And then two, he also still did have training because he came from the Jedi Temple. So even when we see him and he's doing
Ah,
all this Force powers, he
yes.
still had training.
But
So
he had to be identified to even be taken. You have to pass that little force
litmus
aptitude
test,
test before they
right?
even take you. The other thing you got to
Right.
look at is all the things that you mentioned: Luke,
Hmm.
Leia, Anakin, Grogu.
Right.
With them, it's kind of like, okay, Anakin and his offspring, they're kind of like children, grandchildren of the Force. These are all things that exist outside of their midi-chlorian count. It's kind of like a no-brainer, right? Like, yeah, you're going to be have an aptitude because you come from the Force. You know, the midi-chlorian count's just kind of it just comes with the territory. Same thing with Grogu. His species is known to be Force sensitive. All right, so that's
Mhm.
causing the high midi-chlorian count. The other thing we don't know, and this is actually just popped into my head, but it probably has a lot to do with it, is the fact that this whole like unaltered clone, that because she's a clone, right? She's not even a natural like born species of anything.
Mm-hmm.
And that could very well be why too, is maybe part of Project Necromancer was, when Palpatine had commissioned this clone army, maybe he asked, let's pump up the midi-chlorian count in a few of these so I can use them later. Because if you think about it, part of what makes, when people have these high midi-chlorian counts, it's a natural occurrence. But these guys were grown in labs.
Mm-hmm.
So if you really stop and think about it, unless they're engineered to have a high midi-chlorian count, how does that even work? And maybe that's why Omega's like the outlier, because maybe she shouldn't have had one. And that might explain why she's not force sensitive.
Well, to your point, I think to piggyback off of that, I think that's a reasonable conclusion or hypothesis, I would say, because with her being because the clones were based off of Django, so Django has a midichlorian count just like everybody other human in the world has a
Sure.
midichlorian count.
Yep.
So depending on what his was, it's like, all right, the altering process is just the fact that they just sped up their growth, which we're saying that it affects your cells and maybe on a cellular level. I don't know how that affects things. I'm sure it has to,
right?
But and maybe that has tainted her M count in a way to the point where.
But the point is, if she's unaltered, though, like Boba Fett was,
right?
It's kind of like, all right, but her being a clone, period. It's like, if you think about it, anything that comes from something, it should have degraded. So whatever Django's M count was, by virtue of her being a clone, scientifically, it should have been degraded.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the fact it wasn't, and maybe that's what makes it such a mystery. Remember that she is technically part of the Bad Batch, right? She's like a rejected clone, even though she's unaltered.
Well,
kind of.
I think that's the reason why. And that supports what I was saying. Is that I think that's the reason why. Is because she was unaltered. She didn't have, because all the other clones were, not only are they clones, but then they also had the process sped up.
Right. Yeah.
So once again, it degrades it even further. So that's why none of the clones really have, a high M count. And that's why it's probably easier for them to also be controlled too.
She shouldn't have a higher M count than Django, though.
Well, we don't know what her Django's was to begin with.
Let me look it up. Let me see. I wonder if they got that.
Let me ask you this
question. Somebody probably has it.
Or those who out there are listening and watching. Are we so? You were saying earlier that the M count doesn't necessarily determine if you can use the Force. It just shows that you more or less have the propensity to use it. So is that almost akin to saying, like,
I don't know. I guess.
No. This is what I'm saying. Like, so that's almost like saying, if we genetically look at your genes and say, okay, you're probably going to be tall, like 6'5", 6'6", and taller, which means that more likely you probably may have the propensity to be a basketball player because of your height. But just because you're tall doesn't mean that you have the skill set or you're going to have the abilities to be a basketball player. You just may just be almost like, remember we had that conversation, when we were working in a school district, and one of our principals like, okay, because I'm tall, everybody thinks, oh, you must have played basketball. I was like, no, I didn't. Just because I'm tall, I may not be coordinated enough.
Right.
I may not have the coordination skills. To
Even
be
with all the training
player.
in the world, you may never, ever be able to do this.
Yeah, I'm just tall.
Right.
So
and that could very well be.
Smart person,
So basically, Django had a midi-chlorian count of less than 7499.
Okay.
But he was able to defeat Jedi with counts over 10,000. He was like, Cad Bane and Django could kill and beat Jedi that are 10,000 and 15,000, despite them only having less than 7499. That means the midi-chlorian count is still strong and not weak. So it's like they're kind of like in the middle, I guess. Because I think I read, if I remember what it was like the Jedi, just to even look at like the midi chlorian, because that's of course the first thing, right? First thing is you got to see, well, what's your midi chlorian count? Okay, if it's over a certain number, which I think was 3,000, it might have been like 4,000, somewhere in there, 3 to 4,000. And then after that, then they give you that little like aptitude test to see if you, because just because you have a higher midi chlorian count doesn't mean you're force sensitive. And then they do that. But again, I think a lot of this discussion really speaks to the fact that there's a huge lack of clarity in a lot of these storylines.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lack of clarity, but I think this because it may be because they're setting up other series down the line, and those series are supposed to explain it
Right.
further.
And I'm sure
Hopefully,
that's
that
the
is the case.
case.
Yeah.
But I mean, it would be nice, though, if they could at least clarify the stories that they have laid out.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think
Because again, it's like the
that's fair.
midi-chlorian rules, right? Like they keep moving them around so much. It basically becomes lazy storytelling because it's like, well, whatever we want to fit our narrative at the time, we're going to make this happen, not realizing, and I'm talking to the story group here, because it's supposed to be their job to make sure these continuity issues don't arise. It's like, well,
Hmm.
you can't just take a 50-year-old franchise that has built up a collection of rules and then suddenly just change them to fit this one little story you want to tell. No, make the stories fit the narrative of the franchise, not the other way around. And that's not to say you can't expand it, but you still have to play by its existing rules. That's why I always
Well, see,
say
that's
be careful about what rules that you establish in this thing because you're tying the hands of future creators.
well, not only that, but I mean, that's the problem when you're see, and that's a problem when you have it coming out of the mind of one person because George Lucas created all of this. So it's like what he deemed midichlorians, like, okay, by his definition of what he thinks, like how far in advance did he consider that? Or was it just limited just the conversation in Phantom Menace and it wasn't not expecting anybody else to take that and make that a whole story trope. You
Well,
know
I
what I
don't
mean?
know. Well, yeah, I mean, I get that. But I mean, again, though, if you're going to say clearly this is a measurement of force ability, which they
Hmm.
clearly did in the Phantom Menace,
Yeah.
well, you've opened that door. Now,
Yeah.
granted, he, where I think your point comes in very strongly is the fact that he's by himself was controlling the narrative.
Exactly.
And because of that, I think that he never would have come up with a story that would have violated or contradicted that rule.
Exactly. Or
Whereas all these other people are
he would have
like,
pursued it more further than that. And that's the thing. It's like,
right,
oh, well, we could take this and what if we did this with it?
yeah,
Well, because it's almost like you gave them the loaded gun to now shoot up the franchise. When it's like, no, I meant to be just a sniper with it and be very precise. Okay, I'm only using it in this one situation. When it was like, well, why not? We could just take this gun and we can just use it for all this other stuff. And it's like, well, no, that's not really what I wanted to do with it. But now that you sold the franchise and all this content and all the canon that comes with it, you've now unleashed people to now do whatever they want with something that you created, even though it may not be what you intended for it to be used
right.
for.
Is the Oppenheimer of Star Wars?
Exactly.
I mean, it's
Exactly.
like, he just, it's like, look, man, all I was trying to do was just establish that this is a way that you can measure force aptitude, right? Like, this is
Hmm.
how you can measure the aptitude one might have. It's yet one measurement that they have. It's not everything else. I mean, again, I sort of had a problem with it. Like, really, blood tests? I mean, come on, guys. This is kind of stupid, but whatever. He put it out there. But I think that was, like you said, he just meant for that to be like a, hey, this is just yet another thing. And But I mean, if you think about it, that's the one misstep I even think that he had as a storyteller. Now, granted, he also might have been setting up his little nano force things that were going to be in everybody's
Mm-hmm.
bloodstream too. Remember, that was a thing for his
Yeah.
7 through 9. And again, I mean, it's hard to criticize because you're like, okay, well, I mean, it's his thing. He can do whatever he wants with it. But the problem is that he actually had a really good thing, and it's like you shouldn't have tried to explain it that much.
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean,
I think
that's like saying in King Arthur's time, hey, we gave Merlin a blood test because we want to know how powerful in magic he would be. It's like, really?
yeah, it's like Gandalf has this whole,
Right,
or
yeah. Like Gandalf has to
Dumbledore.
go in for his blood test to see how, how powerful of a wizard he is.
Wizard.
Well,
Yeah.
he was wizard, Gandalf the Gray. Now he's Gandalf the White because his blood test came back and he's got, I mean, that's just so round peg in a square hole for that kind of a thing.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too, Eric, is there's, and it serves your point that you made a little bit earlier, where you said like that's just one way because they've always, so a midichlorian count is almost like a scientific way of giving a or seeing if a person, so going back to my analogy of being tall, right? So we can do a blood test and we can say, like, okay, genetically, like if I look at your parents and I say, okay, your dad is like 6'5" and then your mom is maybe like 5'11", there's a good chance that you're going to be a tall person because both of your, genes, your direct genes are tall. And now further down the bloodline, that may be the case. You might have some shorties in your family and you might just get that end of the stick. Who knows? I mean, that's probably what happened to me. But anyway, that's besides the point. Here's the thing though.
You're like
It's
the
like
Danny
there's also
DeVito of the family. Is that
right.
what you're saying?
I'm not, thankfully. That's my cousin. But but the thing is that the force also chooses who it wants, because we also saw with that with Broom Kid. It also chooses who it wants to be, it's omnipotent in that way or sovereign in that case. So it also could be a situation of, yeah, a person, you might take somebody like, okay, Michael Jordan is 6'6", and yeah, he's the greatest basketball player of all time, by most people's standards. But then you also have somebody like, Spud Webb, who was 5'7", who played in the NBA, or Muggsy Bogues, who was 5'3" and played in the NBA. Allen Iverson was only basically maybe five. Some people say he's 6 feet. Some people say he's 5'10". But these guys had incredible careers, even though they didn't meet the height requirement. This, Amazon type league where everybody's like over 6'5", pretty much. So it also just depends on like your skill set too. Looking at that could also say like, okay, well, these guys were still chosen to play the sport despite, no pun intended, their shortcomings.
Well,
So
I don't know. Here's my main issue. And when you get Obi-Wan's explanation, the idea that we had up until the Phantom Menace with this midi-chlorian thing
mhm,
was that the Force flowed through everybody.
mhm,
But what made the Jedi was the Jedi would come and they would train you in the ways of the Force and teach you how to utilize
mhm,
those type of skills. And of course, some were better than others. It's
mhm,
like martial arts, right? You studied
mhm,
martial arts. Okay, you
yeah,
take any kid, you could get them to some level of aptitude with it,
mhm,
some level.
yeah,
So that's kind of what it's like. It's like you have somebody that can train you, first of all. Secondly, your aptitude is just going to depend on, just a natural ability, right? I mean, just, how's your movement? Coordination, things like
mhm,
that. And so that was the Obi-Wan explanation. See, the sci-fi fantasy part of it's cool, you could do all the sci-fi you want with the ships and the lightsaber and all the
Hmm.
technology and all the other stuff. They didn't
Hmm.
have to put any kind of a medical, biological, scientific explanation to the Jedi or the Force. They could have just left it at that. And that would have made infinitely more sense, and it wouldn't have tied your hands like this thing does.
Well, yeah, the whole idea is supposed to be it's mystical. But see, I think the problem becomes is like because when you leave it with the explanation of, all right, um, the force is in everyone, in all living things, penetrates us, binds us, as Obi-Wan said. So the question has always been, well, why can't everyone use the force then if everyone has the
But Broom Kid answered that.
well, and but I think it's one of those that's what I meant when I said the force chooses who it wants to really kind of
And
go
that would have been
forward.
great. The Force could have,
And
like, okay, so you had the training element of it, but then you
but
also maybe, it's kind of like testing out, right? Yeah, the Force just basically chooses you, like, hey, you're going to be the guy.
well, what I'm saying is it's like if you're finding my point is okay, when you talk about the Jedi and they go looking for kids, how do you determine which kids do you pick if everyone has the ability? I think that's what George was trying to say, and I think he was using midichlorians as a like, all right, as a barometer to say, okay, if you we were it's almost like a resume. Like we're not going to look at you unless you have at least a bachelor's degree. So if you don't have a bachelor's degree, we're not even going to consider you. But if you have a bachelor's degree, then it's like, okay, we'll consider you for this position. And I think that's kind of what he was trying to do. But once again, it kind of tied his hands a bit,
But it's an
as we've
aptitude
seen.
thing, right? Like, it's just like with gymnastics or any sport. What do you do? The kid tries out. Okay,
Hmm.
if his skill level, like if you as an experienced coach could see, hey, this kid has some potential, you're not giving him a blood test. Like, oh,
Yeah.
your F count for football is like above a certain amount, so we'll put you in little league. You don't do that.
Right.
You look at the kid, you look at his physique, you look at, are they trainable or whatever, and then you just make that decision.
Yeah, but how? But that's what I'm saying. If you're going like you got to think about it. It's galaxy wide, so we just don't know how many people are just on Earth. If you're talking about a galaxy and we're trying to figure out like okay if you because it's once again because in their minds the Jedi's whole purpose is like all right we want to ensure peace and safety and security for the galaxy. If a person has the propensity to use the force we want them to use that for the good of the order or the good of the universe as opposed to becoming a synth using it for their own selfish and personal and nefarious gains.
Right, which is why they
Well,
take them when they're young.
right, but once again, how do you determine like you if you're going to train them as kids because they're easily to train and they don't have all these attachments and they're almost like empty vessels that you can mold into what you
Because
want them
if
to
you
be.
remember the initial explanation that basically was around the time of the original trilogy, and even Lucas was like selling this idea. That's why all the fans got angry at the Phantom Menace, the longtime ones,
Hmm.
because the idea was, if your kid sort of had like they seem like they're, using the Force a little bit, they would get the Jedi over and call them and say, hey, I think my kid, it's no different than getting into like an advanced education program. My little toddler can read like, textbooks at like 3 years old. I think maybe he needs to be in some accelerated program. So somebody comes out,
Hmm.
gives him a little aptitude test, and yeah, all right, we'll put him in
Hmm.
there. And that's basically what the explanation was. You're
Right.
not, as a teacher, giving a kid a blood test to find out, if they've got like advanced chemistry knowledge or something. I mean, that's when they
Yeah.
get too crazy with the sci-fi. It's like, look, the explanation
Hmm.
had enough specificity into it that it's not like, well, why take every kid in the galaxy? But it also was vague enough that it
Well, that's why I
didn't.
think that's why George came up with that was because he needed something to because if you think about it, that wasn't defined yet. Like it wasn't saying like, okay, so and to your point, it's almost like Charles Xavier from X-Men, right? Okay, he would use Cerebro and he would try to find like, okay, mutants. And it's like, okay, let me try to find these mutants to bring them into my school and I'm gonna train them to use their abilities for the good of mankind. That's essentially what the Jedi basically do.
The Force,
So
the Force alone tells
so
you. Like you get Force vibes off of some kid. Like, oh, I think this kid's like putting stuff out. You're using a mystical power. You're a Jedi. Now you're
right.
telling me you got to take a blood test to really figure it out?
And that's why I'm saying, like, I think that's where it became convoluted, because he was trying to use that as the barometer instead of just using what was already established.
Already
So
established.
and I
Yep.
think we never, but that wasn't like, if you look back to A New Hope, that was never, or any other part of the original trilogy, that was never established. It was never as like, we didn't get that whole, we find them as younglings or kids until the
No, that's not
really we
true.
didn't.
Because during the interviews that he gave at the time, because you have to remember a lot of the information that we got of Star Wars came from either licensed little things that he put out that was directly from him, or it was interviews he gave. Because when you put a really well developed universe out that's seemingly complete right from the get go, a lot of people have some questions, and he would answer those questions, and he sort
Mhm.
of came up with them. And
Yeah, but
it wasn't like he was like going off the top of his head. I mean, he had actually, he had pages of notes, and even before he wrote anything, because don't forget too, he also had at least a rough draft of what was actually episodes 1 through 12. Then he pared it down to 9, and then they're like, "Well, dude, you can't make like a 10-hour movie." I mean, look at the 9 episodes we got now, right? The marathon was like 20 hours. It's like,
Mhm.
yeah, not gonna work in 77. Plus, can you imagine what the budget would have been to shoot that?
Yeah.
So, I mean, a
Well,
lot of that information came from that, and then other stuff. Because remember, the expanded universe didn't hit till 91. So everybody was pretty well versed on all this stuff before the expanded universe came out.
so what you're saying is that in 1977, this information, before people went to the theaters, people knew this
Not
already.
before. It was after. Because, all Lucas was trying to do was just make a good movie that was kind of like Flash Gordon and everybody enjoyed. But as he
But
kept
what I'm
going
saying,
on with these films, he didn't know it was going to be a global phenomenon. And then you get all these like little sci-fi nerds that want, all this, well, what's this and what's that? And then they're challenging him with all these questions. And, it's
well, that's
like,
what I'm saying. Like, so for somebody like me, so maybe for your generation, that was fine. But so for me, and we always talk about, two generations. So you saw it in 77. I didn't see it until the 90s. So if I'm going
because,
based upon the films, what I'm saying is, if you're going to explain, we always talk about this. If you're going to explain, you have to do it in films where, or places where people
yes.
can get the information, and that's never conveyed in the original trilogy.
But he could have conveyed that and taken the information that he was giving everybody over 10 or 15 years and put it in the Phantom Menace. He didn't have to
No,
do that. Because, see,
I agree
in
with
the
that.
original
No, that part I
trilogy,
agree.
right, but in the original trilogy, you had a thing to where you didn't really have to go into, well, how did they get them as kids and all that other stuff. You didn't have to. The story didn't call for it. The
Right.
story really didn't call for it, really, even in the prequels. I mean, I guess kind of because of Anakin. I mean, it was a little bit alluded to in The Empire Strikes Back when it was like, oh, he's too old to begin the training, that kind of thing. That was when you got the idea that, oh, I guess they get them as kids. And that was the whole thing. And of course, Lucas did a whole bunch of interviews around the time of Empire Strikes Back because that's really when that came up. Nobody gave a crap in episode 4. Nobody even
Hmm.
really realized it.
Hmm.
But when it came time to train Luke, and Yoda was like, "No, he's too old to begin the training." It's like, well, wait a second. Obi-Wan's been training him. What are you talking about? And
Hmm.
then that opened that door. And then, of course, by the time the expanded universe did take Lucas's notes and what he was thinking and put
Hmm.
that in there. So now you have, like 8 years of expanded universe stuff that basically reinforced all that. Now you come to the Phantom Menace, where because of Anakin, I guess you could technically say, all right, maybe you do have to explain this a little bit. All he had to do was just put that explanation in there.
Absolutely.
Because if you actually, if you analyze that scene, that scene didn't even need to be. If you took out that whole blood test thing, yeah, the movie wouldn't have suffered one iota, like zero.
And actually, so here's the thing: is like they already established it earlier before the blood test even happened. Because when he saw, it was like, oh, I do pod races. He was like, oh, well, you must have Jedi reflexes.
Exactly.
It was right there. It was right there.
Right there. Like, that's all you needed. You could have just, yep. And you could have gone back to the Luke thing, like, oh, he's bullseye, like Womp Rats in his T-16. It's like, well, that's a little bit advanced. That goes along with what I'm saying. It's like, that's how these kids are identified, and you could feel that through the Force. Like, ooh, I think we need to go to planet whatever, because,
And Obi-Wan could have had a conversation like, hey, do you feel this around this kid? And like, yeah, he does. I do feel the Force around him quite strongly.
Okay. Oh, yeah, and I mean, and they knew that him being an offspring, because that was part of why he was watching him. Like, see what he does.
That's what he asked. He was like, well, who was his father? And I want to say, Qui-Gon already knew. He was like, okay, you have Jedi reflexes. He's like, oh, well, who was his father? Well, there was no father. I just birthed him. And see, that right there should have told him all he needed to know. And then, of course, you can feel what you feel doing the Force, and then just gone on with it. Yeah. And just said, like, okay, we need to take him, and,
all you needed to do. That blood test thing was so shoehorned in there. It's like, I want midi-chlorians. We got to get them in the film. You find me a spot where it works in the film. That's basically that scene. If you and I do intend to go see the Phantom Menace in theaters again at some point, maybe this week. But if you really look at where that thing's, it's like out of nowhere. It's shoehorned in there. It did not have to be in there. And if you had that scene out, it would have been fine. Everybody would have been made the assumptions, and then, of course, that's where Lucas gets a little hypocritical, too, because he's like, well, you shouldn't have to explain everything. It's like, yeah, exactly. And now look what you've done. So here we are. We've got Omega. We don't really know what's going on. And we're still kind of unclear because the season finale, or series finale, felt more like a season finale. And even though the epilogue was nice, I don't know. It just seems like I still don't have... It's obvious that you're giving us the inception of this. That the Grogu thing has a little bit to do with it. And then, of course, obviously the sequel trilogy, particularly episode 9, is where it all culminates into the final order, as it were, right? But still missing a lot of clarity. So hopefully, we get some of that eventually. So, I mean, I don't know. We haven't, it's funny. We haven't actually given ratings for every one of the episodes. We've only been doing it for like a handful.
Mm-hmm.
But in the interest that this is the last one for the Bad Batch, we might as well. So what are you giving it?
I'll give it a 9.
All right. I'm going to give it like an 8.5.
Okay.
There were some things, like I said, that bothered me. But overall, it did keep the same, like the pacing was amazing. Direction, writing, all of it was good. It was still good. It was a great season finale. I probably would have given it a 9. Maybe even a 9.5 if it had been a season finale instead of a series finale. That's what knocks a half a point off for me. But all right, so Monday, we're going to do the whole 25th anniversary of the Phantom Menace thing.
Yes, we will talk more about this whole...
Yeah, I was going to say, we kind of started... Well, we did actually do the whole midi-chlorians episode when Lucas explained it. And we're like, oh, all right, whatever. But yes, I'm sure that'll spill into that conversation as well. And then, of course, the way that we're going to handle Tales of the Empire, because Tales of the Empire dropped yesterday. So the first 3 episodes, like 6 episodes. The first 3 are about Morgan Elsbeth. The final 3 are about Barriss Offee. So what we're going to do, instead of doing every single episode and like tying it up for the next 6 weeks, we're just going to do parts 1 through 3 this coming Friday, where we'll do the Morgan Elsbeth storyline, and the following Friday, or whenever we actually stream, because here we are on a Sunday afternoon, then we'll do the Barriss Offee storyline. So we'll actually divide Tales of the Empire review into 2 parts. We'll just do it that way. So that way it's not tying up a whole bunch of time. Because there's actually a bunch of stuff. Remember, you and I have been texting all these things back and forth. Oh, this would be cool to do. And we should feature that. And then, of course, last Monday, we ended up doing the Will Lucas return to Star Wars thing. But the other choice in that vote was 10 reasons why Rey was not a Mary Sue, according to Screen Rant. So there's still that out there, too, that we could do at some point. So we have a bunch of episodes in the works, so you guys aren't going to want to miss that. So, yeah, tomorrow night, 8 o'clock, we'll be back with a Phantom Menace overview, but we're going to take it from 2 standpoints. Number 1, how is the Phantom Menace specifically, but even the prequel trilogy looked at 25 years later by everybody? How have people, maybe their views have changed and everything else? And then, of course, one of my friends came up with a very compelling argument about why the Republic may have actually been the villain in this whole thing.
Oh, another another Daniel LaRusso being the villain.
Yeah.
Versus John.
I mean, it's kind of like that, but exactly. It's a little bit like, were the Republic really the good guys, or were they really the villains? So we'll be talking about that a little bit in the thing tomorrow as well. All right, and then Friday or whenever, hit the notification bell, subscribe button, like button, all that stuff to make sure that you stay up on when we're able to stream, because it does get a little bit. We try every Monday at 8 and Friday at 11, but it does sometimes float, as is the case today. So with that, I guess we'll see you guys tomorrow at 8. I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
May the Force be with you.
Always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you, always.